My name is Miles Rowan, and for most of my life, I didn't exist. Not in the way people mean when they say, I feel invisible. No, I was invisible. A gray mouse in a world full of louder, shinier animals. I wasn't disliked exactly. That would have required enough attention for someone to form an opinion. I was just overlooked. I'm 35 years old. I live in a one-bedroom apartment in the west end of the city. It's quiet. Like me. I've worked for the same corporation for 11 years, Patterson and Locke, a mid-sized financial firm with too many middle managers and not enough windows. My title? Accounts Review Analyst. My real job? Making the messes other people quietly leave behind look clean by quarter's end. I dress in beige, gray, navy. I eat lunch at my desk. I bring instant coffee from home because I hate small talk around the office Keurig. My manager, Corey, forgets my name at least once a week. One time, he called me Melvin in front of the VP. I didn't correct him. It's easier that way. Less noise. Less trouble. People assume a life like mine is lonely. But loneliness isn't always loud. Sometimes it's comfortable, predictable, like a jacket that doesn't fit well, but you wear it anyway because it's familiar. That was me. Familiar. Harmless. Forgettable. But I remembered everything. The night it all started was the annual company awards dinner. I didn't want to go. I never do. But they strongly encourage attendance, which is code for show up or risk losing the little relevance you have. So I put on my only suit gray, slightly loose dry clean once a year, and went. The ballroom was packed. Chandeliers, jazz trio, rubbery chicken on gold-rimmed plates. I took a seat near the back, next to the photocopier guy and someone from HR whose name I couldn't remember. No one noticed me. They never do. Until the award started. Corey was presenting. Loud, confident, ties slightly crooked. He worked the crowd like a wedding MC. Laughing too loud, cracking inside jokes with his senior partners. He was holding court. Before we move on to Employee of the Year, Corey said into the mic, we want to highlight someone whose, let's call it, memorable mistake cost us a few extra, overtime, hours this quarter. Laughter. My stomach turned. I'm talking about the invoice mix-up on the Cohen account, he continued. You all remember that little debacle? Yeah. Thanks to a certain someone's typo, we paid their retainer twice. Twice. More laughter. And guess who caught it? Corey asked, grinning. Not the guy who made the mistake, I'll tell you that. He scanned the crowd. Where's Melvin? I mean Miles. Laughter. I forced a smile. There he is. Corey pointed like I was a raffle prize. Don't worry. We fixed it. Just cost the firm an extra $9,200 and some Advil. No big deal. The room roared. I laughed too. I had to. But inside, something cracked. Not because of the joke. I'd lived through worse, but because I hadn't made that mistake. Corey had. I cleaned it up. I always did. Quietly. Behind the scenes. And now, in front of 200 people, I was the punchline. Again. I left after dessert. No one noticed. That night, back in my apartment, I sat at my kitchen table under the flickering light bulb I still hadn't replaced. My untouched award dinner gift bag, a branded pen, and a $10 coffee gift card sat beside me. I opened my laptop, logged into Blog. You probably haven't heard of the Margin Man, but by that point, a lot of people had. I started the blog 5 years ago under a pseudonym. It was supposed to be just a place to vent, stories about toxic work culture, quiet exploitation, and the way companies mistake silence for consent. I didn't advertise it. I never share it with friends. But slowly, quietly it grew. People like me found it. People who were tired of being gray. And that night, I wrote a post titled, When the Loudest One in the Room Steals the Credit and the Quiet One Takes the Blame. I didn't name Corey. I didn't need to. The post went up at 11:42 p.m. By 7 a.m., it had 38,000 views. The next few days were a blur. Emails, comments, shares. People from all over the country wrote to me. Anonymous corporate workers, burnout teachers, interns, senior analysts, even a guy from a warehouse in Detroit. This is exactly what happened to me. I didn't know anyone else felt this way. Thank you for writing this. I read every message. Something changed in me, like a flicker of warmth in a cold room. Like maybe, just maybe I wasn't crazy. I wasn't wrong for being frustrated. I'd just been muted for too long. That's when the email came. Subject, Partnership Inquiry. From Editor-in-Chief, CorporateClarity.com. I stared at it for a long time. They wanted to feature my writing. They offered money. They wanted to interview the Margin Man on a podcast with 2.4 million subscribers. I didn't answer immediately. I wasn't ready for that world. But something inside me whispered, "They see you." And it didn't stop there. A week later, I was contacted by a mid-level editor at a major publishing house. "Have you ever thought about writing a book?" She asked it casually, like it was a normal thing. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to cry. I wanted to say yes. At the office, Corey hadn't put the pieces together. Not yet. But people started treating me differently. A few colleagues started swinging by my desk. Not to mock, but to ask for help. Guidance. Quiet conversations like, "Hey, you ever write about burnout? Or that blog? Not saying it's you, but damn." Even the VP walked by one afternoon and patted me on the shoulder. "I heard you've got some interesting thoughts on accountability," he said. I just smiled. Let them wonder. Let them connect the dots. For the first time in my life, silence became power. They say visibility changes people, but I didn't feel different at first. Not in the mirror, not in my voice, not in the slow, quiet mornings where I still made instant coffee and read finance articles like nothing had shifted, but the world around me started bending, just slightly, as if some invisible lens had been adjusted, and suddenly, for the first time, I was in focus, and it began with the simplest change. People saying my name, not as a joke, not as an afterthought, but with intent, with weight, with a new awareness. And at first it unsettled me, made me wonder if I was imagining things, if I was reading too much in a Corey stopping by my desk with a limp half-smile, asking if I'd seen the latest industry compliance update like he actually cared what I thought, or if I was imagining the way Jen from payroll suddenly started sending me meeting invites, as if my presence was expected, not optional, and maybe I was imagining all of it, until one Friday morning I walked into the break room and found 3 coworkers sitting around my blog, pulled up on a phone, whispering like school kids with a secret. And when I stepped forward and they realized I was there, the silence that fell wasn't awkward. It was respectful, curious, even reverent, like they were in the presence of someone they hadn't understood until just now. And it was in that moment, that tiny flicker of pause, that I felt the shift wasn't just happening outside of me. It had finally reached my skin, my bones, my center, and something old inside me, something tightly coiled, began to unfurl, not in arrogance, but in awareness, and that awareness carried me into the following weeks like a tide. I couldn't fight, even if I wanted to, because the messages kept coming. The podcast episode aired, and the comments were explosive. Thousands of listeners writing in, quoting my words, sharing their own stories of being overlooked, of being gray, of being the backup plan, the filler, the one no one remembered. Until something went wrong, and someone needed to blame someone, and each message felt like a thread being pulled from a vast, frayed fabric of quiet suffering, and I started to realize that this wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who'd ever been told they didn't matter because they weren't loud enough, charming enough, connected enough, and I was being asked to speak for them, to write for them. And when the publishing deal came through, 5 figures for a short book, part memoir, part manifesto, I didn't hesitate, didn't ask if I was qualified, didn't second-guess the way I always had before. I just said yes because somewhere deep down, under years of erasure, there had always been a voice, a steady, observing voice that had cataloged everything and was now finally being invited to speak. And as the weeks turned into months, my presence at work became a paradox, still technically in the same role, still showing up every morning in my same gray coat, but no longer invisible. No longer safe to ignore, because people started watching, whispering, asking for input, seeking my approval in subtle ways. And Corey, the man who once made me the butt of his jokes, started tripping over his own confidence, offering me unnecessary praise, asking me to co-lead internal reviews like it was his idea, like he'd always believed in me. And I let him think that for a while. Let him believe I hadn't noticed the sudden shift in tone, the desperate attempts to align himself with my rising visibility. But I remembered everything, and I began documenting, slowly, meticulously, not for revenge, at least not yet, but for clarity, for control, because when the spotlight finds you, people forget that the gray mouse had eyes long before it had teeth. And as my social media following ballooned and speaking invitations rolled in, from colleges, from HR summits, from nonprofit panels, I started to spend my weekends traveling, standing in front of rooms filled with people who saw something in me I'd only recently begun to believe in myself. And I would tell them my story, not with flair or dramatic flair, but with honesty, with a kind of calm power that came from having survived invisibility and chosen to walk back into the light. And the most surreal part of it all came one rainy Tuesday when my phone rang in the middle of a quiet afternoon and the caller ID made my breath catch. Mom. And I stared at the name for a long time because we hadn't spoken in 3 years. Not since the argument over my brother's wedding where I wasn't invited to speak, wasn't even listed in the program, and she'd said something like, "You always keep to yourself, Miles. People don't know you." And I'd said, "That's because you never tried," and hung up. And now here she was calling because she'd read the article in the Times about my blog, because someone at church had mentioned seeing my video online, because suddenly her quiet, forgettable son had become a name people recognized. And when I swerved, her voice was hesitant, almost soft, like she wasn't sure she had the right to speak. And she said, "Miles, I had no idea." And I said, "I know." And that was all, just those 2 words, not angry, not bitter, but enough, because it was the truth. And for the first time I could hear it land, heavy, real, and I knew she'd heard it too. And from that moment, everything changed, not in a flash, but in the slow, certain way tectonic plates shift under oceans, invisible but unstoppable. And I knew then that this was only the beginning. Not of fame, not of some dramatic transformation, but of presence, of being in the room and knowing I had every right to be there. And as I walked into the office the next morning and saw Corey glance up, his face caught between a smile and fear, I knew that soon the man who once mocked me would realize he had made the worst mistake of his career, underestimating the gray mouse. There's something intoxicating about being seen after years of being overlooked. Not in a narcissistic way, not in the cheap thrill of applause or fleeting fame, but in the quiet, undeniable shift when people who used to glance past you now stop mid-sentence when you speak, when their eyes track your movement across a room, not because they want something from you, but because they're afraid they miss something about you. And that's the space I had stepped into, this strange, reversed universe, where the old rules didn't apply anymore, where the Miles they remembered, the one who brought the extra chair into meetings and took the minutes without being asked, was now the same man being quoted in national magazines and interviewed about invisible labor. And it was in that contrast, that perfect tension between who I had been and who I was becoming, that I found my leverage, because while the outside world was praising me, reposting my words, and inviting me to speak on panels about dignity and modern masculinity, the people inside Patterson and Locke were unraveling one careful stitch at a time. And I didn't raise my voice or slam my hand on any tables. I didn't send scathing emails or call anyone out in public. I simply started paying attention. Louder, if that makes sense. I started showing up with questions, pointed ones, in front of the right people. And suddenly Corey couldn't brush past me anymore. Not when I asked him to explain why the Q3 variance report had been altered after final approval. Not when I pointed out, casually with a smile, that the updated client protocol he had claimed credit for had originally come from a memo I'd sent him privately 2 months prior. And at first he tried to deflect, to play the same games he always had, laughing a little too hard, overcompensating with condescension. But the room wasn't on his side anymore. The air had changed. And people who once ignored the way he stepped over others were now watching him through a new lens, one I had quietly handed them. And it wasn't just him either, because once you change how people see one man, they start looking differently at everyone else too. And I became the gravity in that shift, the quiet center pulling focus away from flash and back toward substance. And then came the town hall meeting, quarterly, mandatory, always long and useless. Except this time the CEO decided to open the floor to employee questions. Anonymous, via a platform they thought they could control. And when the third question popped up on the screen and read, "Why are so many internal promotions based on charisma over contribution?" The whole room froze because everyone knew what that meant. I didn't smile, I didn't glow, I just turned slightly in my chair and looked at Corey, and he saw it, he knew, and it was in that moment, that shared silence, that I realized my presence had become a mirror, forcing people to see what they had always tried to laugh away, and the ripple effect was immediate, because the VP of Compliance emailed me personally asking if I would be interested in consulting on a new internal audit strategy, and HR requested a meeting to discuss my insights on engagement equity, which was their way of saying, "We know you know what's broken, help us fix it." And for a while I thought maybe that would be enough. Maybe just the satisfaction of knowing I had reshaped the room would be its own reward. But then something happened that brought everything into sharp, undeniable focus. My brother, Caleb, called me out of the blue, his voice smug and familiar, like we'd just spoken yesterday, even though we hadn't spoken properly in almost 4 years. And he said, "Saw your article in Forbes, not bad for the quiet one." And I laughed, a short, bitter sound I didn't plan, and he didn't seem to notice. He just launched into a monologue about his new real estate venture, how he was thinking of pivoting into something more purpose-driven. And maybe I'd want to invest, help him out a little, give back, and I let him talk, let him pitch, let him pretend we were equals. And when he finally asked if I could meet him for lunch, I said yes, because sometimes revenge isn't about punishment. It's about presence, about making someone sit across from you and realize they can't spin the old story anymore. And when we met at the overpriced steakhouse he chose, I showed up wearing the same kind of bland jacket I always had, and I let him talk, nodding, smiling, and then, when he asked again about the money, I leaned forward and said, "You remember that Christmas when Mom made you give me the broken Game Boy because you said I just ruined the new one?" And he blinked, caught off guard, and I said, "You remember what you said that night? You said, 'No one remembers the spare,' and I watched it land, watched him flinch just slightly, and then I said, 'You were right back then.' But things change, and I don't invest in people who forgot I existed until they saw my name in print." And I stood calmly, paid for my own drink, and left him there blinking in the new light of who I'd become. And that lunch, that moment, was the final proof I needed that I wasn't just being seen. I was being remembered, and not just by strangers or followers, but by the very people who once convinced me I was forgettable. And when I walked back into work the next day and found an envelope on my desk with a formal invitation to lead a cross-departmental task force on transparency, I knew the timing wasn't coincidence. I knew I had crossed a threshold, not because they wanted to reward me, but because they wanted to contain me, to fold me back into the system they once used to ignore me. But it was too late for that, because I'd already rewritten the script, and I wasn't going to trade relevance for silence again. Not now. Not ever. It started with a chair, a simple metal-framed conference chair tucked into the far corner of the strategy room. The kind of seat I had taken for years out of habit, out of reflex, because that's what invisible people do. They make themselves small so others can feel big. But this time when I walked into the room for the quarterly task force kickoff, the one I had been appointed to lead, I didn't go to the edge. I didn't wait for someone to glance up and gesture that I could sit down. I walked to the head of the table, pulled out the chair reserved for whoever was in charge, and sat down, silently, without apology. And I saw the way the room shifted, the way eyes darted, and I saw Corey pause in the doorway, his usual swagger stiffening just slightly as he realized what this meant. Because even though the memo announcing the task force hadn't listed names, even though it hadn't said, Miles Rowan is now leading the very thing you were supposed to control. Everyone knew, and more. Importantly, he knew, and that knowledge began to eat away at him slowly, quietly, the way mildew creeps through drywall before the house realizes it's sick. I didn't gloat. I didn't weaponize my position with loud declarations. I simply led the room the way I had always worked. Informed, efficient, unflinching. And that combination, the same one they once dismissed as boring, suddenly felt like a threat to men like Corey. Men who built their reputations on noise and borrowed brilliance. And it wasn't long before the cracks began to show, small at first, like the snide comment he made during our third meeting, pretending to joke about how the quiet types make great assassins, and the laugh that followed was thinner than usual, forced, and when no one laughed back, he coughed and looked down, and I simply moved on, as if he hadn't said anything at all, which was worse than confrontation, because it left him with no ground to stand on, and from that moment he knew I wasn't going to. play defense. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was steering, and once you realize the mouse has become the architect, the whole maze starts to feel different, and I kept building, not with schemes or sabotage, but with evidence, with facts, with every email I had quietly saved over the years, every sloppy forwarded document with metadata that proved who really wrote what, every discrepancy in meeting notes. Every line Corey had plagiarized from my reports and repackaged as his own. I had it all, not because I was vindictive, but because I had learned to live in the margins, to survive in silence. And survival in silence means you collect things, receipts, timelines, truths, and one by one, I began to feed those truths into the right hands, starting with the new compliance officer, a woman named Dana who had transferred in from an aggressive legal branch downtown, someone with no loyalty to Corey, no history with the boys' club. And when I asked her if she'd be interested in seeing some legacy workflow gaps, her eyes lit up the way a detective's might when someone finally opens the last drawer of a cold case file. And within 2 weeks, an internal audit was launched, quiet, discreet, but thorough, and I made sure I wasn't connected to it directly, just an advisor, just a contributor, and I kept doing my job, showing up on time, producing flawless documentation, leading the task force with poise while Corey fumbled through his own presentations, suddenly under scrutiny for things no one had ever questioned before. And the most beautiful part was that I never had to raise my voice, never had to expose him publicly, because Corey began unraveling all on his own, like a man who realizes the room he built was full of mirrors, and he doesn't like what he sees anymore. And when he started snapping at people, blaming junior analysts, sending late-night emails trying to preempt issues no one had raised, it only confirmed what the audit team was beginning to find: discrepancies, inconsistencies, inflated performance reviews, and questionable vendor approvals. Things that in isolation were forgivable, but in a pattern were damning. And all I had to do was stay steady, stay sharp, because Corey wasn't being pushed out by scandal. He was being buried by his own paper trail. And when the HR director called a closed-door meeting with senior staff and I wasn't asked to leave, I knew it was done. I knew they were going to ease him out with a quiet severance package, maybe let him resign with dignity. But the legacy he'd built on my silence was gone, and that was the real victory. Not the firing, not the humiliation, but the erasure of his false legend. And I stood at the center of it, not as a hero, but as a witness who had finally been believed. And the moment I truly understood what I'd done came not at work, but at home, when I received a message from a man named Thomas, a former employee from a company 3 states over, who said he'd read my blog, read my book, and used it to confront his own manager who had been quietly plagiarizing his work for years. And he wrote, "You gave me permission to stop apologizing for being smart." And I sat there in my quiet apartment holding my phone, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. Not pride, not vindication, but peace. And I realized that this journey, this long walk from shadow to clarity, wasn't just about Corey or work or even family. It was about reclaiming the right to exist without asking, to be present without explanation, to matter without spectacle. And I knew then that the final step wouldn't be revenge. It would be what came after, when there was nothing left to fight for. Only the space I had carved, finally mine, finally earned, and I was ready for it. There's a strange kind of silence that comes after the storm. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of stillness. The kind that wraps around you like a new coat you're not sure you deserve. And in the weeks after Corey's resignation, after the audit quietly concluded and the firm's leadership sent out a sterilized email about leadership transitions and continued excellence, I found myself sitting in the same office I had walked into for 11 years, same carpet, same blinking overhead light, but everything was different. Not because they gave me a new title. I declined the one they offered, actually something vague and shiny like Director of Compliance Strategy, but because I didn't need the title anymore, didn't need the badge or the brass plate to validate what I had become, because now when I spoke, people listened, not out of obligation or hierarchy, but because they'd learned what happens when you ignore the quiet ones. And that awareness had changed the fabric of the place, changed how meetings ran, how ideas were credited, how people paused before interrupting someone in the corner of the room. And I could see it ripple beyond me, in small ways, in new names being added to project leads, in analysts being invited to present their own findings instead of watching managers steal the spotlight. And I kept writing, Not for fame anymore, not for the surge of likes or comments, but because it mattered, because the stories kept coming, people kept reaching out. Nurses, teachers, retail clerks, IT consultants, all of them carrying years of invisibility and finally seeing in my words a reflection they'd been denied. And one day, I received an invitation to speak at a conference on workplace equity hosted by a coalition I had admired for years. And I accepted, not because I needed the stage, but because I wanted to look out at that room and remind them that their stories weren't isolated, that being overlooked didn't mean being unworthy. And as I stood behind that podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, I thought about how far I'd come from that corner desk with the squeaky chair and the half-used gel pen, and I told them about power. Not the kind you steal or inherit, but the kind you earn in silence, in margins, in long nights, in unthanked mornings. And they stood for me, not out of pity, not out of politeness, but because they saw something real. And after that, the invitations kept coming, but I never stopped showing up at the office. Still kept the same desk, still took the same route to work, because I wasn't chasing a new life. I had built one inside the same walls that once ignored me. And then one afternoon in late fall, I got the call, the one I thought might never come, my father's voice on the other end, brittle, cautious, like he was afraid I wouldn't pick up again after all these years. And I almost let go to voicemail, but something in me, something calm and unflinching, said answer. And he said, "Miles, I saw your talk." And then silence, and I waited. And he said, I didn't know. I didn't know what you were carrying. And I told him you didn't ask, and he sighed, long and low. And he said, "We were wrong, your mother and I, about a lot of things, and I didn't need an apology, didn't need a confession or a parade of regrets. I just needed him to say it, to acknowledge that I'd been real all along." And after we hung up, I sat by the window of my apartment, the same place where I once wrote that first post, that first small howl into the void, and I smiled not. Because everything was perfect, not because I had wanted some neat Hollywood ending, but because I had survived and become seen without ever pretending to be someone I wasn't. And a week later, when my brother Caleb sent a message, just 3 words, "You were right," I didn't respond, didn't need to, because this story wasn't about them anymore. Wasn't about Corey, or my family, or the office politics, or the years of being forgotten. It was about presence, about owning space without apology, about proving that relevance isn't given. It's claimed slowly, steadily. And when I walked into the firm's holiday party that December, same ballroom, same bland jazz trio, I wasn't escorted to the back table this time. I was greeted by name, handed a microphone to give the welcome speech. And as I looked out over the sea of faces, some familiar, some newly respectful, I said something simple, something I meant with every part of me. There are people in this room who used to forget I was here. And that's okay, because now you remember. And I paused, not for effect, but because I could, because the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of all the years I waited, full of every whispered comment and ignored contribution and erased moment. And now I stood in that space, not loud, not grand, but undeniable, and I realized something. Visibility isn't the opposite of invisibility. It's the reward for staying yourself long enough to be seen. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just a shadow in someone else's light. I was the light, and they saw me.